Because now I want to focus on the reform. And I want to focus on, basically to break it into 4 regions quickly. As you all know, Western Europe emerges as a leader for drug policy reform beginning in the 1970s. It's the Dutch first in 1976 with the change in their cannabis law, the evolution of the coffee shop system, not by law but by policy, right? You then have in the 1980s the fear of HIV and drug addiction. The Europeans, together with some extent the Australians and a few others, take the lead in harm reduction approaches, rapid access. Remarkably, in 1985, Margaret Thatcher, of all people, says that we need HIV prevention must be even more important than drug prevention. Therefore, we are going to make needle exchange part of national policy. The evidence quickly shows that those countries that institute needle exchange and other harm reduction policies quickly, Australia, Netherlands, England, managed to keep their HIV rates among injecting drug users at under 5%, whereas those countries which don't, oftentimes, like in the United States or parts of the United States, go up to 25, 30, 40, 50%, right? The United States, we mostly don't do it, right? We essentially, if we had adopted the policies that England and Australia and the Netherlands did on HIV and needle exchange and harm reduction in the 1980s, roughly 250,000 people who died would not have died. Just the magnitude we're talking about this. But the Europeans take the lead on this. Then the Swiss, as you know, with the heroin maintenance, and I won't go into the whole story here, but the Swiss, Zurich, the problems of the drug addicts, the point that Niels made before, the value of the currency, Swiss, the most expensive currency in the world. Therefore, any drug seller wants to get their drugs to Switzerland because you get the most return for for the sale of your product, right? And then after the failure of the needle park, they go to heroin maintenance. You have the emergence of the safe injection sites. You in Norway now finally have a safe injection site. I just visited, very well run. Hopefully you will have heroin maintenance soon, in the next few years. The evidence overwhelmingly showing effectiveness, right? Europeans leading. But also what you see in Europe is it begins to plateau. There's the period of crisis in Germany, and then it quiets down as they institutionalize harm reduction. Right? And now you have in Europe this problem where under the Dutch, the government that maybe just fell, maybe the cannabis policy is being pulled back now and foreigners can't go. The English have fallen behind now. But Portugal, with their model of decriminalizing the possession of drugs, where nobody goes to jail for possession of any drug and nobody gets drug tested. You get a ticket, you get an encouragement to go see a health board, but they try to focus on the most difficult problems of the intersection of drug addiction and mental illness, but a commitment not to criminalize the possessor and not to rely on coercive drug testing or forcing people into drug treatment. So in a way, Europe emerges with the Dutch model on cannabis, and I'll give the Swiss the credit on heroin maintenance. Now Germany, Netherlands, Denmark, the UK, to some extent Spain tried it, Canada tried it on the heroin maintenance, the safe injection sites, pushing the envelope on harm reduction, and then the Portuguese model. Dutch, Swiss, Portuguese, as sort of the 3 leading models for how to deal with drugs in other ways, right? Leaving aside the legalization model, right? The more kind of let's treat all drugs as a more or less legal model, which comes from a libertarian way of thinking, or sometimes a non-libertarian, but a sort of obvious sense that if the negative consequences of prohibition are sufficiently severe, we need to do something about that. And I'll come to this in a second. But so in Europe now, the Czechs, they're in a step forward. The Danes, who did so much new good stuff in the last few years, right? Some progress. Norway, it's inspiring to see the change in Norway over the last 5 or 2. Compared, there was almost no difference between Norway and Sweden, to my Americans' knowledge, 10 years ago. There's a difference now. The Swedes have a lot to learn, and hopefully they know how to learn from Norway. You can answer that better than me. But that's Europe, and Europe playing an increasingly important role in the UN and the international system, beginning to challenge the American, and the American strategy has always been to try to find the defector, among the Europeans. The Swedes they knew they could count on, right? I mean, the Swedes don't like to lock up people for 50 years, but they know that everything else, the Swedes are so abstinence-minded and resistant to harm reduction, or at least they have been, right? So the Swedes were always the tough guys in Europe on this stuff. But then if the Americans could find, like, Berlusconi's guy or something like that. Norway, by the way, Norway's delegate to in the UN circles has been relatively good. The Norwegian government has actually played a more progressive role in recent years in the international UN circles than was typified by the Norwegian policy. An unusual situation. That was Europe. The second thing that's happening, and they're furthest behind, is in Asia. I mean, Asia is even more punitive than America in many respects. In Asia, in many countries, anybody can be pulled off the street, drug tested without cause, and if they test positive even for cannabis, can be required to go to something that's not really a prison, but is sort of a coerced treatment program, right? You know, in some countries they cane you, they cut your head off, or, I mean, you know, Saudi Arabia, some parts are like that too. But it's interesting. Now, one can find needle exchange programs and methadone programs in Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, China, Iran. If somebody had said that 10 years ago, you're going to find needle exchange programs and methadone programs in China, are you crazy? But what happened in each one of these countries was that the government officials became so terrified by the spread of HIV and by predictions among HIV experts that parts of Asia could begin to look like Southern Africa was with HIV, except not. And it would be spreading first by and among injecting drug users and then through sex workers and into the broader community, that the sense of pragmatism began to bubble up. Now, there's still little pockets of pragmatism, happening just in some cities, but the fact of the matter is they broke through. So you actually, there was, at the International Harm Reduction Conference 6 years ago in Belfast, somebody from the Chinese government says, our ambition, our desire is to have 500,000 people in China on methadone maintenance in the next 10 years. You know, China, with the opium wars, the horror of these things, that had emerged. The needle exchange program still in a police environment, and, you know, but still it popping through. And Iran, in 2004 or 5, the Ayatollah, who is the Minister of Justice, issues a fatwa. You know, the fatwa like go kill Salman Rushdie because he used the name of Muhammad in vain, right? Issues a fatwa, a religious edict, saying that methadone and needle exchange are okay under Sharia law. Right? So you now have a fairly substantial harm reduction system, once again intermingled with a remarkably repressive governmental system, but nonetheless, their experiment, I was talking with a physician there before, works at the drop-in center, and he was saying, you know, here we have methadone, buprenorphine, and there's a discussion about heroin maintenance, but we can't do anything in between. If you're managing the pain of a cancer patient or the pain of somebody else, we have an infinite number of options. But if you're managing somebody addicted to heroin, all we have is methadone, buprenorphine, or maybe we'll get heroin, right? And everything else. You know, in Iran, they're actually using like tincture of opium. They're trying a little more. I mean, there's actually a level of experimentation even in repressive Iran. Why? Remember, Iran and Pakistan have the highest per capita heroin addiction rates in the world. So that's the level of pragmatism. So Asia is not exactly the Asia of old. It's still a highly punitive system, you know, but I went to give a talk in Singapore a couple of years ago. And what I said to them, just to kind of jerk the chain a bit, I said, you know, you guys, everybody in Asia looked to you on drug policy until recently. You guys are no longer the leaders. People are looking elsewhere in Asia now for more pragmatic approaches. So that's Asia. Now, the stuff I'm most excited about, in part because it's on my side of the ocean and the one I'm most involved in, is what's going on in the United States and in Latin America. What's happening in Latin America is really remarkable right now. And For years, they had been stuck. I mean, it's obvious. What's going on in Latin America, until recently, there were not major problems with illegal drug abuse and consumption. Here and there, the injection drug problem, somewhat in Brazil and Argentina, but not so much the rest of the continent. You know, there was the problem of pasta básico, the Latin America, what they call crack. There was problems there, you know. But basically, the problems there were the problems of prohibition. As with alcohol prohibition in America. Crime, violence, corruption, black markets, adulterated drugs, prison, all of this stuff, right? That was their problem. And every once in a while, somebody would say, we should just legalize it. But that could not go anywhere. More and more people were thinking, we need to change this dialogue. But the U.S. said, no dialogue, no discussion. Organization of American States, thou shalt never speak of alternatives to prohibition in the Organization of American States. I mean, that's the mentality, right? The U.S. giving money for Plan Colombia, which was essentially a counterinsurgency program marketed to the American public as a counter-drug program. I can explain that more later. Then Plan Merida to help the Mexicans, right? Now Central America. The situation in Central America with prohibition-related violence is even worse than Mexico or Colombia was. And the U.S. says, and they're saying, can we get a plan in Central America? And the U.S. is saying, no, we're out of plans. You know, we did Colombia, we did Merida in Mexico, no more plans. We can't keep giving money away like this, you know. And the sense, people are then looking what's going on in Mexico. 50,000 people dead in the last 6 years from violence related to the gangsters and the war between the government and prohibition, and the levels of corruption and the horrific killings and beheadings, and in some places the traffickers becoming the actual sovereign power, the ones who replacing government, and not in benevolent. I mean, they would give lots of money to build a soccer stadium and do some nice things, but ultimately it's not who you want in control. Legally regulate other drugs. Then harm reduction is clearly the way to go. Some of the Latin Americans did not really understand it the first time around, right? Ruth Dreyfus, the former president of Switzerland, and when Switzerland led the way 10 years ago, she plays a very powerful role. So the grand dame, the grand old lady, explaining harm reduction wherever she goes, right? They say we must look at the decriminalization not just of the drug consumer, but also of the low-level dealers and of the couriers who sell it. Because what is the point of continuing to incarcerate them? They say we must focus on reducing the harms, not just of drugs, but the harms of failed prohibitionist policies. And once again, they say we must break the taboo. And who else joins? Kofi Annan joins. Kofi Annan, the very politically cautious former UN Secretary General. And why does he join? Because he's looking what's going on with the drug trafficking and drug corruption in West Africa, and he's looking what's going on in Central America, and he's going, my God, West Africa is going to be looking like Central America, Mexico, and Colombia before we know it, unless we change these policies.